All right, everyone, so bear with me. In this video, we're going to talk about the pathway that oxygen and nitrous oxide take in order to reach our patient. I'm not just talking about the path it takes in the circle system, I'm talking about the whole path it takes from the pipeline source outside of the hospital in order to get to the common gas outlet. So we're going to be talking about our anesthesia workstation. And you can see I'm doing this in a little bit of a different format just to keep things really neat and lined up and organized. We'll probably break this down into 2 or even more videos just to keep things short and try to simplify it. So this topic is pretty important because it's part of our everyday machine check that anesthesia providers do. It's just to ensure that our machine is working before administering anesthesia. Very similar to how pilots have their flight checks, their pre-flight checks. This is what anesthesia providers have, a checklist to make sure that our machine is working. There are no leaks, there's adequate oxygen, that everything is working smoothly before administering anesthesia to our patients. So as you can imagine, our machine involves a number of check valves, pressure regulators, and gauges, in addition to some alternative routes of oxygen in the event of an emergency. So the first thing that I want to note is that in order to keep our patient oxygenating, we need oxygen. So oxygen comes from our pipeline supply here, and it moves towards our patient and is able to deliver oxygen through the common gas outlet. So the pipeline oxygen supply is located in a separate building near the hospital campus or in the hospital campus, just around, but in a different building connected by a bunch of tubing and reaches our operating room. So likewise, we have a pipeline nitrous oxide source in addition to that. So just like I mentioned before, failure of delivering oxygen through this pipeline, failure of the pipeline delivery of oxygen would be detrimental to our patient. We would not be able to administer oxygen, so we always, to counteract that and to mitigate that, we always have a backup E-cylinder oxygen and nitrous oxide tanks in case we were using this for our anesthetic and our pipeline nitrous was not functioning or malfunctioned. We would be able to administer nitrous. So we always have these E-cylinders. They're called E-cylinders. So emergency cylinders. So we don't want to keep using this all the time. We want to use our pipeline first and save our E-cylinders for emergencies. These E-cylinders are located usually behind our anesthesia machine in the operating room. So the next thing that I want to talk about is check valves. So remember when I mentioned our pipeline oxygen makes its way, it goes towards our patient. Well, we need a series of check valves that ensure unidirectional flow towards our patient. This pipeline oxygen, we don't want it to backflow. We want it to go forward. We don't want it to go down. We don't want it to go too high up. We want it to maintain a unidirectional flow towards our patient. So that's where our check valves come into play. So there are about 7 check valves, and it's similar to the one-way valves of our circle system that I talked about in another video. And these 7 check valves are noted right over here in these areas, usually shortly after our gas source once it enters the pipes of our machine. So these are our check valves. The next thing we have are pressure gauges. We want to know how much pressure is in each of these tanks, these E-cylinders. We want to know how much pressure comes out of our pipeline because that gives us a good indication for if there is a leak, if there's inadequate supply of oxygen or of nitrous oxide. The pressure gauges will tell us that. So these are our pressure gauges here. I illustrated 4 of them. One coming from our pipeline sources, and then another one coming out of shortly after our E-cylinder sources. So in order to properly store the oxygen in these E-cylinder tanks, and nitrous oxide in these E-cylinder tanks, the pressure within each tank must be pretty high. So let's focus on our oxygen E-cylinder. So the pressure within each oxygen E-cylinder tank is 2200 psig. So you have a high pressure of oxygen that's stored in this E-cylinder. Likewise, you have a high pressure 745 psig of nitrous oxide gas stored in our nitrous E-cylinder. So knowing the pressures at each of these stages of the anesthesia machine is critical. It's critical because we do not want to administer too high of a pressure to our patient, because that would cause barotrauma. So the way that we counteract that is we have all of these pressure gauges which help us detect leaks, and it also helps us detect how much pressure is being administered to our patient. So let's talk about the pipeline pressures now. Our pipeline pressures are much lower than our E-cylinder pressures. However, they're still pretty high, and they could potentially cause barotrauma to our patient. So the pipeline pressures of both nitrous and oxygen are about 55 psig. So definitely lower, but still at the same time relatively high to administer to our patient. So because we want to save our E-cylinders for emergencies, we don't want our E-cylinder sources to overcome or override our lower pressure pipeline sources. Because if you didn't have any sort of way to decrease the pressure in our E-cylinder, and you open both the pipeline oxygen and the E-cylinder oxygen, your E-cylinder, the higher pressure, would win out and it would flow faster to our patient. So we have to have a way to decrease this E-cylinder pressure. And that is what we have our pressure regulators for. So our pressure regulators decrease our E-cylinder pressure down to 45 psig, both in our oxygen source and in our nitrous oxide source. So what does that mean? That means that now our pipeline sources are higher, 10 psi's higher than our E-cylinder sources. So that means our pipeline sources are going to be preferenced over our E-cylinder sources. If there is a leak or if there is a low supply of oxygen, then our PSI is going to be lower than our 45 psig, and from that, our E-cylinder pressure will kick in. So there are a couple more pressure regulators that I want to talk about, but we'll just call it for this video. Just to briefly summarize, we have a pipeline source, we have E-cylinder sources. The E-cylinder sources are stored at much higher pressures than our pipeline sources, and in order to use our pipeline sources first, we need to decrease the E-cylinder pressure using a pressure regulator so that our pipeline source is preferenced. We have a series of check valves that allow unidirectional flow and pressure gauges that allow us to detect the pressure at different parts of the system.